Let's take a moment for a prayer. Father, we ask you to send your Spirit upon us and upon our country. We ask that we may have a peaceful election and that the divisions that hold our country apart may disappear. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. We were beginning to talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, and the real question as the Industrial Revolution got going was whether or not the conditions that came with the Industrial Revolution were worse than those on the farms that the people left. And the answer seems to be they weren't. People lived together, they were living longer, populations were rising. Today we attribute the great growth in population and the health of the people to the fact of better nutrition, and that all came from Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, as bad as it was in the situation, was better than what it was replacing. We tend to look back at the Industrial Revolution in a very romantic way that came much later. And the romantic way of the paintings of the peasants, working in the fields and all that they had no medical. Children were forced to labor. People were like slaves. It was really a bad thing. And the Industrial Revolution, as horrible as it was better. And that's why so many people were fleeing to the cities and getting involved in the factories and everything, and left the farms that later painters would present as so idealistic. At first, the church did not take official note of the plight of workers. The Methodists and the Quakers actually were communities. Remember, they oftentimes speak in England of being a high church or a low church, and the low church was really the Methodist, and they were oftentimes known as the Methodist Episcopal. But they were considered the low church. They were the workers. And the Quakers historically have a phenomenal ability to be about the needs of very serious social problems. They seem to really be onto that all along. So anyway, the Methodists and the Quakers kept in touch with the workers. In the United States, it was the Catholic priests who were involved with it. And that was peculiar to the United States, largely because the Catholic priests came out of Ireland, that were impoverished society, and the workers they came over to serve, the poor Irish, were in fact the people working in the factories. So the church was very much involved in that, the Catholic Church, but mainly in the United States. There was a man by the name of Frederick Osamom who founded the Vincent de Paul Society to care particularly for unemployed and the disabled. We studied St. Vincent de Paul much earlier and his concern for the poor and everything. But when the Industrial Revolution came on the scene, the two things that were really important were the unemployed. Now, you understand when you have a farm and you have someone who's unemployed, they eat because you have the remnants of the farm and this sort of thing. So in a farming community, unemployment doesn't mean you don't eat. But in an industrial setting, unemployment means you don't eat. And the second thing is the disabled, because people were treated as though they were part of a machine. So if you were in the job, let's say your job was running something in the mill, and you lost 4 fingers in an accident in the mill, you lost your job as well. And then who's going to hire someone with only one hand? So these things are very serious problems with the Industrial Revolution. I would compare it to the United States today. Probably the most serious problem in the United States today with regards to our society setup is the condition of the elderly. And that's because so many people move around that they're abandoned, and so often families are broken up, and so there's no one to take care of them. So in the words of Pope Francis, the United States built warehouses for the elderly. And that's going into all kinds of societies now. The first time I went to China, older people were held in great reverence. And the last time I went, that was about 20 years later, you find that the elderly are being warehoused, much like the United States. The first time I went, I should mention, was before the Tiananmen Square thing, and afterwards was after that. But it was separated by about 20 years. Vincent de Paul also cared for the aged and the sick, but that's hospital work like they were doing. This particular man attacked verbally and in writing selfish factory owners who did not allow people to benefit from their work. When you look at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, if you were a person who had the money to found a factory, then you paid the people as little as you possibly could. And if they wanted more money, you found someone who didn't want more money. But that's where this period, at the beginning of this, we see the accumulation of massive wealth in the United States in very few individuals, okay? Now it's happening with technology, but then it happened with these people who built these things, but they didn't really share their wealth. One of the interesting things, when Sears and Roebuck started, Sears and Roebuck insisted that every person who worked at Sears and Roebuck was in fact a shareholder in the company. And you received shares according to how many years you were there. The longer you were there, the more you were a shareholder. Then I forget the name of that, but they used it as a way of making sure that some of the wealth of the company went to the workers. Some companies did that, but at the beginning none of them did. This man urged Catholics to get involved and did not want things to be left in the hands of a government that served the rich first. This is something we see historically. Rich people have a great ability to influence the government in many ways. Like at the time now, rich people, you can't just buy a government like you could in the past. But today, rich people, through their ads, like in the United States, the amount of money that's poured into elections, that a lot of that money, it really comes from strange places. And I think when we watch it, it's fascinating to me how often you will hear a candidate who's running, basically everyone saying that they're going to raise taxes, and then everyone who's supporting them says that they're going to lower taxes. And we see these opposite positions on all different kinds of candidates, and so much so, and so often, you aren't really sure what it is one way or another. It's strange. But anyway, he wanted to make sure that the government was not controlled by the rich, which it would be at that time, as it came to be. In 1848, working classes wanted much better conditions, and there was a strong nationalism sweeping the world. People wanted their country to be united in a single state under one government in which people had a say. Now, if you were to look at, you could sort of see it like in Mexico and South America, Spain was really running it. In Canada, England was running it. In Holland, Spain was running Holland. I think Austria was running most of Germany. Parts of Venice was its own country, and parts of Italy were under Venice, part under papal control. But people wanted to get together, and the way they wanted to get together was language blocks. They figured language blocks were the way to unite people. They wanted an end to little tiny states ruled by a prince or something like that. And that's what you would find, for instance, in France. You'd find all these little tiny things and these princes all loyal to the king. Uprisings began to explode all over Europe. In the first 3 months, 4 Italian princes were forced to grant their provinces constitutions. In February, the French drove the king out of Paris. Milan and Venice drove out the Austrian rulers. The Papal States now were an area where revolution had been simmering for years, and they stretched across Italy, including Rome. Papal States went right across the middle, and they're what largely kept Italy in these separate Milan, Venice states and that sort of stuff. And that's also why they would fall to countries like Spain or Austria or something like this, because they were small states, couldn't really defend themselves. Pius IX granted the people in the Papal States a liberal constitution, but revolutionaries from outside incited violent uprisings in Rome. Pius IX fled to Naples, and Rome declared itself to be a republic. French troops came to the aid of the Pope, and he returned to Rome. But now you see, his returning to Rome, Rome's under control of the French now, because that's the way the Pope got back. King Louis Philippe in France was removed, and the people began to demand social justice. This is the fomenting of the post-revolution business. The workers' movement became violent. The Archbishop of Paris lost his life trying to calm the crowds, and the violent turn of events caused many Catholics to leave the movement. So this movement for liberalism in France, now many Catholics will leave it. What we will watch over the whole world is, as the liberal movements rise, one of the things the liberal movements are demanding is a change from the royalty and stuff like that. And we mentioned before, the bishops and stuff had come out of the royalty. And so what you would end up is the church would end up on the side of the government. And then parish priests oftentimes would be on the side of the people. But the church, really represented by the bishops and stuff, would be on the part of the government. In France, the revolution was a success. In Milan, Vienna, and Prague, it was put down. In some areas, constitutional governments emerged, which was an improvement over absolute monarchies and the enlightened despots who had been in power. As a result of all this, the church came to be seen as allied with the ruling powers, the royalty, and lost the support of workers. General people, common people, no longer supported the church. A movement began which tended to be called Pan-Slavism. In Poland, these political ideas were united with their religion. So in Poland's very strongly Catholic historically. So this Pan-Slavism, mainly, the Slavs over a large area, the Union, it became united with the religion. And a strong leader called Adam Mackenzie rose in Poland. He was a poet and a powerful organizer. He was deeply spiritual and called for a spiritual renewal of the people that might lead to peace and concord. What he wanted to do was bring about the liberalism, but bring it out without a war. And so he wanted to do it as a spiritual movement. Through his writings, he has inspired the Poles, and I would say he inspires them even up to today. In Italy, an Italian priest by the name of Rosmini wrote a book called The 5 Wounds of the Church. And what he was talking about was the problem of the church was being independent of civil government and at the same time being made up of people very involved in politics. So while the church wasn't being controlled by the government, it's that the high people in government were the high people in the church. And so in essence, while the church wasn't being controlled by government, it was controlled by the people in the government, which in essence is the same thing. He wrote that the church suffered as a result of too much dependence on the state and a refusal to modernize. I would say that one of the things that the American Revolution brought about and spread through the world is the fact that the church does best independent of the state. So the church is really bought into that. But this refusal to modernize is something that plagues the church over a period of time. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but one of the interesting things, we've had several very, very modern popes come in. And when you have a really modern pope come in, and he lives a long time, they die very conservative. And largely because they were very modern about these new ideas, but ideas keep changing. So what they were very modern about comes to be old-fashioned, not that they go back to the other. And then the church stalls again. But the church has had a great difficulty with this whole thing of modernization. And it's interesting, in the beginnings of the church was pretty good with this. We had no control over governments at all, and they were against us and stuff. But we pretty well found a way to adapt to the Greeks and then the Romans and this sort of thing. But anyway, he said that the church should adjust itself to the idea of democracy sweeping the church, sweeping the world. Many wanted him condemned, but the Pope refused to condemn him. That was a good thing. Okay? So he said that the church needs to adjust to democracy. What the church position basically was, we need to let the democratic thing start out, to end the whole deal. But the democracy should elect a ruler. And then they should be an absolute ruler, and go on as old monarchs really had. And while this may look kind of strange, you have to know that's the position of the church. We elect an absolute monarch, and when he dies, we elect a new absolute monarch. The only difference in the church, it doesn't pass father-son, that sort of thing. So, anyway, the Pope refused to condemn the book. Many people said that we should not adjust to democracy, we should keep moving against it. But at least the Pope didn't condemn the book. Today, we look at Rosmini and see that the ideals of democracy are not only in harmony with church teachings, but actually foster the growth of the church. I don't know if I've ever said this before, but when I was in UC Berkeley, I took a class on film, and one of the teachers in the class on film was Alfred Hitchcock. And at the time, he was making the film The Birds. But anyway, Alfred Hitchcock told us a lot about his kind of suspense. And one of the things he told us, the two things I remember most about it, are number one, he said that in a horror film, like Psycho or something, in a horror film, he says you do not want to have surprises, like someone jumps out from behind a wall with an axe or something like that. He says you don't want surprises. A good horror film, you know exactly what's going to happen. You see the man behind the door with the axe, you see the woman coming in the front door, and you take forever to have it happen. He says that's the way you do it. And if you look at his films, you do that. The second thing he said is that one of the keys to really good suspense is for a person to be terrified of the very thing that will save them. And I'll tell you a quick story about my mother that I always think of with regards to this. But my mother used to work in a mall, and when she was in retirement, she sold carpeting in a mall. But the people who work in a mall have to park their car at a distance so the people who are shopping can be up close. And my mother was always kind of paranoid, but she would go out to her car at night and get in her car and drive out. She was very fearful as she went out. She had to stop for gas one time, and when she stopped for gas, the attendant, she paid him. It tells you when it was. They actually did the gas. But anyway, she probably slipped a $1 bill out to him, just the width of the window. And he came back and told her it was counterfeit. And she says, okay, give it to me, I'll give you another. He said, I can't give a counterfeit bill back to you. And she says, okay, I'll give you another $1. He says, no, you have to come in and sign some papers for the counterfeit bill. And a long discussion went on until he was able to convince my mother to get out of the car and go into the station with him. How he did it, I have no idea. But as soon as she got into the station, he slammed the door and told her, call the police. There's a man on the floor in the back seat of your car. But you think of her, all her terror was on, do I get out with this man? And the real problem was in the back seat. And he couldn't say anything because she was locked in the car with that man. And if the man realized. But if he could get her out, then they could do it. But that's exactly Hitchcock. Exactly that sort of thing. But we will watch that in the church. The church was terrified of democracy. And democracy ended up being the best thing that happened to us. Science seemed at first to threaten the teaching of the church on creation. Now we see it gives us a much deeper understanding of the how of creation. So a lot of times when science began to grow, the church was afraid of science. They're afraid of evolution, afraid of this. I think one of the wonderful things of John the 23rd, it's something that is deeply embedded with Roman Catholicism. He said, you must never be afraid of the truth. But the difficulty with Roman Catholicism, they didn't notice before John the 23rd, is that truth doesn't always come from the church. Truth can come from science, and every one of us will admit there's truth that comes from our experience. You and I know certain things because of the experience of our life. So truth can come from many different places, but truth is always powerful, and truth cannot be denied. Okay, so this is really what we look for. So he says that the disagreements about how the church should adjust to the modern ideas actually persist to our own day. One of the really interesting things, people don't know this sort of thing about the Catholic Church, but as a student of Scripture, I'm allowed to question whether a certain text was written by a certain person or came out of or all these kinds of things. I'm not allowed to teach that because that could be confusing to people. If I were to say the Apostle John, had nothing to do with the gospel account of John, many people would hear in that, well, maybe it's not inspired if it wasn't written by the apostle. But that's not the issue. We know it's inspired. The question of how it got written and who wrote it, where it was written, is another question entirely. We're not questioning, whether it's inspired. But you have to be careful how you discuss these things. So a lot of discussion about different things with regards to morality and all this sort of thing. Big one now is homosexuality. But these things are being very, very much discussed. But they can't be taught yet because no one's resolved them. They are in the middle of being discussed as to what they are and how they work and that sort of thing. So, in 1850, Pius IX, after being returned to Rome by the French, remember he was taken back, tried to make Rome the true spiritual center of the church. So he became interested now in the church being seen as a spiritual center, not so much as the capital of the papal states, but as the spiritual center. So he gave many, many papal audiences, established national seminaries in Rome for the students of many nations. If you go to Rome today, the cassocks, I know there's a red cassock, they look like cardinals, but if you look at them, they're about 15 years old. A red cassock means you're from the German seminary. There's a set, I think the one from the American seminary, I think the cassock is black with blue piping. But the cassocks designate, and most of the big Catholic nations, Poland and I shouldn't say Catholic nations, but nations with large Catholic populations, Great Britain, Ireland, all these places, they have a national seminary. And the advantage of that has been amazing. One of the big advantages is those seminarians, because they're studying together in the city of Rome, get to know one another. And so the church is interconnected in these nationalities. And many of those people end up bishops. And so it really has brought a great unity to the church. It's been a wonderful move. Pius IX believed that the existence of an independent papal state was necessary for the independence of the Pope, and he fought any new ideas that he thought would undermine the faith, like evolution and stuff like that. He fought anything that he thought would undermine the faith. He recognized that the Pope had to have an independence, and so he thought the papal states were necessary to that. We will see long after the papal states are gone, and we have this treaty with Italy, you'll end up that the Pope has complete independence in an area that's smaller than many ranches in the United States. It's just a smaller, but he has the independence of the government. It's curious that you see the same thing happen with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has come in to live in India, largely because the Chinese have taken over Tibet. But in India, he isn't involved with the religion of India, which is the Hindu. So they have no problems with him. He's there and he lives in absolute independence and is able to govern. But his papal states were Tibet. I mean, that was where he was both the political and the spiritual leader. But to have a strong spiritual leader, it's good for them to have independence of any government. That served the Catholic Church very well in the Second World War, that at no time was a church, under. And so things that bishops in Germany could not say, the Pope could say. And things that bishops in Italy couldn't say, the Pope of Vatican was able to say. And where the church was under pressure, you can have the Pope speak for that in independence out. It's a wonderful thing, ultimately. During this period, there was a very curious and dramatic growth in devotion to the Virgin Mary. We aren't really sure why, but it really grew. And in 1830, Catherine Labouré had a vision in France. Mary asked the nun to strike a medal. We call it the miraculous medal. The miraculous medal came from Catherine Labouré. And the medal has the inscription, "Mary conceived without sin, pray for us." Belief in the truth that Mary had been conceived without sin was a strong tradition among Roman Catholics, but theologians were not convinced of it, but it was held strongly among Catholics. Pope Pius IX consulted with the bishops of the world and found that they had universal agreement with the idea of the Immaculate Conception, and he declared it a dogma of the Church. And this was simultaneously a statement of papal authority, that he didn't call a meeting, we didn't have a council or anything, he declared it a doctrine of the Church. Now, he consulted with all the bishops, but it wasn't a council. So it showed the exercise of the power of the Pope. Remember, that's what Pius IX is about, reestablishing and making strong this business of the authority of the Pope. And so he did it with that. But the Immaculate Conception, one of the things that really helped it, you really have to have some kind of a biblical basis for Catholic doctrine. And one of the things that goes on is that as history goes on, we come to a deeper and deeper understanding of the Greek that was used in the days of Jesus by the people who wrote the scriptures. And an example is when the angel comes to Mary and says, "full of grace," the term "full" in English, let's say if I had a glass and it was full of water, we could say it's full. Well, there's a word in Greece where you could look at that and say it's full, but not the word the angel used. The word the angel used means this was always full. Okay? This is absolutely permanently full. So when the angel said full of grace, what he's saying is, what the angel is saying is, Mary was never without grace. And that's what the Immaculate Conception means. From whenever her life began, from the conception of Mary herself, there was no touch of original sin. And that's the meaning of the doctrine. It's very simple, but they came to a better understanding of the Greek at this time, and that's why the Immaculate Conception could be declared. Throughout the world, there were factors like the Industrial Revolution, science discoveries, theory about the origin and age of the Earth. See, this was a time when scientists were beginning to discover how really old the Earth was. And people were thinking the Earth was so many thousand years old. And the way the people came to the conclusion of the age of the Earth was they went back the genealogies and added up ages, and then add another 100 years or something. But anyway, they came to a point where they said they knew where the world started, and that they used that as a marker, whereas scientists were discovering the Church's age was in millions of years. There were dramatic changes in people's living conditions that caused them to question religion. And religion had been the heart of people's lives. You know, even when I was raised in San Diego, in the area in which I was raised, people's primary gathering place was their church. The Lutherans would gather at the Lutheran church, Catholics at the Catholic church, but people's primary gathering place was the church. It was their primary thing. Today, it's your work. Okay, that's your primary gathering place. But the living conditions caused these people, they had no time to go to church, no time to pray. Remember, the Industrial Revolution was grinding people. The more you could work, the better you got paid or fired and that sort of thing. So many were interested in a greater say in government and began to see the church as an enemy, because the church, again, was against the fact of democracies. So when they wanted greater say in the government, they saw the church as someone who was moving against them in order to get that kind of say. Two particularly troubling ideas began to surface at this point in the general population. The first was atheism, holding there was no God at all. Now, the date on this, I'm going to go back just to show you. The date on this is 1050. And, you know, atheism begins to show up. Isn't it interesting how late atheism, 1850, you know, how late that comes about? If you go back historically, you find out there are a lot of people who believe that God doesn't have a lot to do with us. There are a lot of people who believe that God created the universe and then stepped away from it. A lot of people believe God intimately involved with the universe, but God was the reason there was a universe. No one argued that at all. God was the reason there was a universe. But now people begin to argue maybe there was a universe without God, and they're looking at evolution and everything. The second idea was holding agnosticism, which says that God really doesn't matter because we can never answer the question. You know, when I was in the seminary, we were taught really strong proofs for the existence of God, and they're really wonderful proofs, provided you believe in God. If you don't believe in God, those proofs won't convince you. And we believe that belief and knowledge are two different things. You cannot know on the face of the earth the existence of God. You can believe it, but you cannot know it, okay? But you can't know there isn't a God either. That cannot be known, okay? So we have to understand there are certain things that are things of faith. But for this time, this is the first time these two ideas, atheism and agnosticism. I would say the big one in the world today is agnosticism, that it's an unanswerable question, so it doesn't really matter, okay? In our own day, this takes the form of what's called a practical agnosticism, in which the existence of God is not attacked, but it's ignored. Whether or not there's a God has no effect on the way people are acting, but no one really denies the existence of God. That's why that takes the form of the statement, I'm sure you've heard from a lot, I'm a very spiritual person, but I don't go to church. They have no religion or anything, but that's the idea that, you know, the existence of God's not really attacked. They know there's a spiritual entity, but it just has no effect on them. The various Christian churches understood at this point that we were all under attack. And the correct response to such a situation is to rethink one's position, carefully considering the other position. But this isn't the way church reacted in the 19th century. Okay, churches didn't act this way. But if we find ourselves at complete odds, what you want to do is cross over and look at the issue from their side. Have them cross over and look at it from your side, and then you come to a resolution. As an example of evolution, our side is that God created everything. Their side is that there's an evolvement of things in which everything flows one from another, even producing life and the variety of life and this sort of thing. Okay? And so evolution or creation, these two things are going back and forth. However, if the evolutionist decides to look at it from our side, they actually see the fact of who created has nothing to do with how he did it. So they could accept God did it by the different stages of evolution. And a believer who goes over to the other side makes the same discovery. The fact that this is how it came to be doesn't say anything about who made it. So now you find most theologians believe, as we say in the Creed, God, creator of heaven and earth. And simultaneously, we believe the earth was created by evolution. Okay? So, but they didn't resolve things that way at that time. It just wasn't really done. Ludwig Feuerbach said religious feelings about God were in fact human feelings attributed to an imaginary God. So I guess a way to put this was he thinks that God was actually created by people, so that as I watch things go on in the world over which I have no control, if I get sick and the doctor says there's nothing more we can do, I want someone I can appeal to, so I can appeal to God. Or if they tell me one thing or another about going on, forces in the world, rain and stuff like this, we created God so we had some place to refer things when we couldn't deal with it. Okay? Religion was only a dream of the human mind, and people would better use their time and energy focusing on nature. So he says, rather than dealing with the ethereal God or not, we should spend our time understanding nature. His views influenced an awful lot of people in the Germany of his day. And I guess the major person he influenced ultimately was Karl Marx. Auguste Comte in France said that there were 3 stages to development of thought and human history. The theological age was first, in which God was the explanation of everything. I'd like you to know that for some people, this idea of God as the explanation of everything, it is a very powerful thing. And you watch historically a lot of, I wouldn't say so much atheism as agnostics, a result of what I call the shrinking God. An example would be, before we knew anything about electricity, God was the one who sent lightning. Once we understood electricity, then we know lightning and how it works, okay? Before we knew much about astronomy, God was the one who eclipsed the moon or the sun or anything. But God was the explanation of the unexplainable. But if God is your explanation of the unexplainable, each time something is explained, God shrinks. And for these people, science is the ultimate enemy of God, because science is explaining all these things. So the more that's explained, the less there is of God. Okay, so he calls that the theological age. God explains everything. The metaphysical age is one in which everything is explained by abstract forces such as nature. So rather than saying God did it, we would say nature did it. Okay? nature being probably just another form of talking about God. But he calls this the metaphysical stage, okay? And he says the final stage is positive philosophy, which explains everything by scientific research. And he said, in this way, humanity would replace God. Okay, so God's the explanation of everything, then nature explains everything, and now science explains everything. When science explains everything, then God's gone. Incidentally, science explains it by its understanding of nature. So you see the way. In England, Darwin's book, Origin of Species, about his discoveries, seemed to cast doubt on this belief, on the belief in creation. So we have Darwin's book come out now, Origin of Species. When I was a youngster in my home, we had a book on our bookshelf. We had lots of books, but we had a book on our bookshelf called Our Face from Fish to Man. It was very interesting watching the evolution of bone structure and stuff to produce the man thing. But this was obviously Darwinian, but and an old book. I think it was written in the 1930s, but an old book. But really it was interesting in the way he went about it. Darwin proved that animals evolve over a period of time, and in a later book, he included humans in the process. We always think of Origin of Species as being a terrible thing about watching the evolution of animals, but the fact of the matter is, there's nothing in Origin of Species to put human beings into it. That will come later with a second book. So at the beginning, he didn't do that, but people could see the obvious way it was going, so they reacted very strongly against it. But he seemed to be on track with it. Something people don't know about Darwin. Darwin was the child of a minister, and his entire life he was deeply religious, although few books have had more negative an effect on religion than his book, The Origin of Species. One of the things that I like about Darwin is that Darwin is a very committed believer who will not in any way deny his thing on God. He is at the same time a very committed scientist who will not undercut what he sees as facts, but he doesn't know how it works together. And I think you've got to admire a person who will not attack truth, whether it's spiritual truth, this sort of thing. And the fact you don't see how it works together, I mean, what is the big deal, okay? Over a period of time that happened. Another example of the same type of person is the priest Teilhard de Chardin, who had the same dilemma. He would not give up the notion of creator and would not give up the notion of evolution. And eventually those are the people that work out these issues. In Denmark, a man called Søren Kierkegaard taught people in an ascetic state lived moment to moment. He was describing his own experience in the university. As a university student, he said, people tend to live in an ascetic stage in which you deal with things as they come, just moment to moment. He says, people in an ethical age accept duty as a part of life. So in the university situation or in this aesthetic age, you do not see duty. You see what has to be done and do it and this sort of thing, but you don't have a sense of duty to yourself or to others or anything. The duty isn't there. He had a deep feelings of guilt and anxiety. That might say something about his college life too. But he looked at the difficulties that he'd endured in his life, a father that was too strict, and the conflicts with his conscience during university life, and wondered if they were signs of divine displeasure. So he was thinking the fact that he was, so concerned about his salvation, and the fact that he had such a mean father and everything, is this a sign somehow that God's against me or God's working against me? He devoted his whole life to writing and thinking, and he decided there were these two stages in life. He says the aesthetic stage in which people live moment to moment, and the ethical life. But he says the ethical life is built on duty. And he believed that the people needed, in order to find happiness and joy, you needed to live a life that was based on duty. It's interesting to note that he's German, and you'll notice that that's a strong trait. That's one of the difficulties you find in someone like, forget his name, the Lutheran pastor who was executed by Hitler. But that man, in the beginning, he was so torn up because he understood everything that was happening was wrong, but he did not have within him any way to react against authority. And that's that whole thing of duty. It was very, very difficult to deal with duty. Kierkegaard believed that the universe was not a nice, responsible place where nature, God, and humanity lived in peace. And in this state, one had to make difficult choices. In the religious stage, he says a human faces God, the completely other, unknowable, absolute, in fear and trembling. So he says in the religious stage, a human being stands before God. And when we stand before God, God knows everything. God is absolute. God, all these sort of things. So he says, we stand before God in fear and trembling. And when I went through grade school, we had to memorize the Baltimore Catechism. And it was very strict. We had to memorize it, and we gave all the answers and everything. After Vatican II, religious education really changed. And so there weren't memorized answers, but they were taught about a relationship with God. And it was really interesting to me to watch children who came out of that, and their feelings about God were very different than ours. I looked at God almost as a judge because I had all these rules and everything we had to follow. And these kids come out with a very different view of God. In fact, I'll tell you about a first confession that to me personally really showed the difference in the church. We had confessions at the school here, Old Mission School, first confessions. And what we did was we went over and heard first confessions the week before we were having first communions. And so we would go over and hear so many in the second grade class each day, and then we had first communions. And I think I went in there about maybe on a Monday, and after first communion, the following Saturday, a little girl comes in, and she says, "Bless me, Father, it's been a week since my last confession." I'm thinking, a week since your last confession? And I said, did you just make your first confession? And she said, yes. And she says, I enjoyed going to confession so much, I wanted to come back. I'm thinking to myself, honey, that was not my first confession. That's not the way it was for me at all. But this notion of what it is, what these things were, have been very changed. But he says you come before God in absolute fear and trembling. Truth was not to be found in reason, but in a blind leap of faith, a faith that itself was a gift from God. This is very well stated by a man called Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich talks about the leap of faith. He describes it as a cliff. And you stand on top of the cliff, and all you see below you is fog. Now, you've been told there's water down there, but all you see is fog. And the question is, will you jump off the cliff? He says, no person who's ever jumped off the cliff has landed anywhere except in the arms of God. But many people are too afraid to jump off the cliff. Okay? Now that sounds kind of strange, particularly when you consider that faith is a gift. I mean, if I have it, if God gives it to me, I jump off the cliff. If he doesn't, I don't. But anyway, this was most true in Christianity because it demanded the acceptance of the fact that Jesus was God and human, while humanity was infinitely different from divinity. And the relationship between Jesus being human and Jesus being God is an endless question in theology. And you'll find people whose belief that Jesus is God means that Jesus knew everything the moment he was born in the stable. And you'll find people who believe that at the moment of the resurrection, he was surprised to discover he was God. Okay? In the Catholic Church, you must believe he's human, you must believe he's God. How that works together, though, all different kinds of theologians try it. But you think about it for a moment. If divinity, God's divinity, is infinite, when you add humanity to it, you still have infinite. You can't get any bigger than infinite. So how does humanity fit in to the infinity of God? It's a question. I don't think anyone has yet come to an answer. He said the gift of faith demanded totally unquestioning obedience to God. Okay? And the gift of faith does give us that. It gives us obedience to God, but it's not so much unquestioning. Like one of my favorite scenes appears in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, when Jesus is in Gethsemane and contemplating. He knows what's going to happen as far as being arrested at that point. It's a foregone conclusion. I don't know if he knows it's going to end in the crucifixion and stuff like that, but he knows he's about to be arrested. And the song he sings is really good in the musical. He turns to God and he says, "You're very strong on what and when and how, and very weak on why." And you get that impression. But in our faith, we believe that you're supposed to question God and find out, and allow yourself to grow. And it's like, I'll give you an example. You go into a doctor. This last week I had to go in. I had a tooth problem, so I had to go in. So I go into the doctor, and he has a machine that takes a three-dimensional picture of my tooth. I'm going to get a root canal, I guess. But anyway, he goes through this whole thing, and he comes in, and I know nothing of what he's talking about, and he explains the thing clearly to me. I still know absolutely nothing about what's going on and how. He goes through the whole thing. And ultimately, I'm going to have the procedure and everything and have it done. But the fact of the matter is, my faith is in the doctor, not in what I got. And that's true in life. My faith is in God, not that I understand things. I try and understand some of them, but my faith remains in God. Kierkegaard was highly critical of all Christian churches. And he attracted attention in his lifetime in Denmark, but was really unknown outside of there. Kierkegaard was not a big deal at the time, except in Denmark. He was very well known in Denmark. However, in the 20th century, he came into his own, and he's a great influence on both religious and secular thinkers. I would say that if you were to go into schools of theology today, you would find a percentage of all the doctoral theses each year are on Kierkegaard. I think you'd find that. He's very highly studied. In this period, as I mentioned earlier, there were several reported visions of the Virgin Mary in the Catholic community. Catherine Labouré, we talked about the miraculous medal, in 1830. Two shepherds in La Salette in 1846. I don't know if you know about them, but two shepherds had a vision of the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary would direct them, and we have films of them. It's very interesting. They walk very directly, and their heads are pointed straight up. They never fall on the rocks or anything. It's a field. It's a very curious thing. Bernadette Soubirous in Lourdes in 1858. Now, all of these took place in France. These were all in France. And a little bit about Bernadette. I don't know how much you know about it. While gathering wood near a small stream, she saw a beautiful lady smiling at her from a grotto at the side. News of the apparition spread. There were other visits from the lady, and cures and things were taking place. Soon there were crowds gathering for the apparitions. Bernadette's parents, and the parish priest were greatly disturbed. They wondered about her sanity and about her safety because of the crowds. Bernadette remained calm and answered questions in a calm, simple way. They asked her questions, she answered them very simply. It reminds me of the dialogue in the Bible where the man born blind is being asked by the Pharisees, "Were you blind?" "Yes, I was." "Were you cured?" "Yes." "Who cured you?" "Jesus cured you." "How did he cure you?" "He put mud on my eyes and told me to wash." Just because it's very, very simple. Bernadette was just like that. Didn't have to make explanation. Just pure and simple. The lady did at first not tell Bernadette who she was, but the parish priest finally asked Bernadette, "You find out from the lady who she is." And when Bernadette asked her who she was, she said in French, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And this is 4 years after the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception had been declared, because the Immaculate Conception is a complicated concept. The clergy did not preach about it. I don't think I've heard 2 sermons in my entire life on the Immaculate Conception. But the parish priest was able to tell Bernadette that the Immaculate Conception was Mary, and the apparition had the effect of spreading the dogma of the Immaculate Conception in popular devotion. Then they were able to spread the title and everything. At the direction of the lady, Bernadette dug a small spring. There's a river below where the apparition took place. There's a river below. And so in the alcove, Mary told her to dig in the dirt, and she did. And as she did, water began to bubble up, and that water now flows into the stream, okay? And water still flows from the stream and has been responsible for countless claims of cures. I say claims because there are lots of cures, but in order to have a cure documented as coming from Lourdes, you must be able to prove you were sick and then prove you're well afterwards. And the problem is that many people go to Lourdes without getting the definition that they're sick. And then if they're cured, that's well, but you can't prove you're sick. To me, the most dramatic cure in Lourdes is a little girl who was born without cornea. And she had x-rays and everything, had it all set up. And she went to Lourdes, and at Lourdes she was able to see after she washed with water. And she came back, she still has no cornea. But for some reason, she sees, okay? So there have been some very dramatic cures there. Pius IX, in 1846, becomes the longest reigning pope in history. He tried to give a clear-cut statement of the position of the church on various issues. Now remember, he came in a very liberal man. We mentioned that at the beginning. And his statements were not always concerning religious ideas, but often strayed into political and social changes, which he viewed as dangerous to the church. Like, for instance, remember he wanted democracies, and he wanted constitutional monarchies, and he wanted all this stuff when he came in. Now he's locked there because they're moving away from constitutional democracies to pure democracy. And that isn't, kind of what he's about. He was and is bitterly criticized. At the time of his death, admitted the world had changed his policies, and his policies belonged to a bygone age. As he was dying, he realized that he was out of step now. He had been there very much, but at that point he was out of step. He published what is called the Syllabus of Errors, which is a list of errors in the world. He listed 80 statements on various subjects, often quoted out of context and often difficult to understand. Some issues dealt with doctrine, like the existence of God and the divinity of Jesus. That was simple. Some statements dealt with modern ideas, saying that the Pope could not be expected, and he said that the Pope could not be expected to go along with liberalism and progress. I'll give you an example. One of the things that he condemned was modernism. And what is modernism? No one's really sure. In order to be ordained, when I was in the seminary, you had to sign an oath against modernism. And so we listened to 3 classes. Now, we're people who are finishing 8 years of college. This isn't, new students. So we're educated people, educated in philosophy as well as theology. And then they explained to us none of us knew what they were talking about. The only thing is, I knew I was against it. I wanted to be ordained, but I had no idea what it was. But that comes out of the Syllabus of Error. Many people of very good will were seriously offended by the syllabus. It was against democracy, against people's participation in government, that sort of thing. The furor raised by the syllabus was somewhat calmed by Bishop Felix Denpanlu, who wrote that the Pope was thinking of an ideal world, and if the real world, liberal ideas had to be tolerated. And the Pope accepted this interpretation. But he says he's looking at if the Pope could design the world in which the church existed, this is the world we want. But you have to admit, he can't design the world in which the church exists. The church exists in the world that is. And so the Pope actually accepted this interpretation. In 1869, the Pope summoned an ecumenical council, the First Vatican Council, because of a war breaking out between France and Prussia, which were major Catholic countries at the time. In 1870, that council actually never finished its work. It's curious, we had the Second Vatican Council with John the 23rd, but the First Vatican Council actually was never closed, okay? This council reaffirmed the supernatural nature of the church and the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, okay? So the Pope has universal jurisdiction, but the supernatural nature of the church. It's not government, it's not this sort of thing, but it has to do with spirituality. There was a spiritual character of Christian revelation and papal infallibility. So this whole idea of understanding the spiritual thing, like papal infallibility, in order for the Pope to make an infallible statement, he has to say he is making an infallible statement. He has to clearly make it, and it can only refer to faith and morals. So he couldn't make a clear scientific statement. Like I've heard people say, the church teaches that life begins at conception. That's a science thing. When does life begin? The church doesn't say that, okay? The church says you must treat it as a human life from the moment of conception. But the church doesn't know exactly when that begins. So it says, many bishops did not want to declare the doctrine of papal infallibility, although we accepted the truth. At this time we're talking 1869, so for almost 2,000 years, the Pope has been speaking the truth to the church. So we in general accepted papal infallibility. But to say something is true does not necessarily mean it's something that needs to be made a doctrine. The doctrine could be seen as an effort on the part of the Pope to control everything. And that's what you hear a lot of times from non-Catholics who think that the papal infallibility means everything the Pope says is absolute truth, period. And you really saw a reaction like that when the Pope gave his teaching on birth control, Paul VI. But remember, that's a science thing, the birth control business. So almost 10% of the bishops left early so that they wouldn't have to vote on the issue of papal infallibility. But it was accepted. In time, even those with doubts accepted the outcome of this particular council on papal infallibility. Okay? We'll stop it there. And the next thing we're going to begin with is the rise of a movement that's known as Romanticism. Thank you very much.